Ella Taylor, Acting Head of Innovation, Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles, DFT.
My role as Head of Innovation, Connectivity and Data is particularly focused on the transport networks. What I'm keen to understand is what kind of infrastructure do we need to start delivering? What changes to the infrastructure might need to take place as a result of the introduction of connected autonomous vehicles? And what is our evidence base, and is this all for good? So while we kind of often say, you know, this is fantastic, these vehicles might be really productive, they might be really easy, they'll go door to door. This could have negative impacts on your walking and cycling agenda, and we could end up in gridlock and a bit like Wall-E. So trying to understand what the kind of potential way that we could manage this disruption is. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Wolfgang Schuster. I'm with Atkins. Atkins is a engineering consultancy firm of about 18,000 people, but recently acquired by SNC-Lavalin. So now we are about 55,000 people spread across the world. I'm the technical director of the intelligent mobility practice, where our core areas of focus are about the design of new IM operational concepts, the implementation of these concepts, ensuring obviously the protection of these concepts as well, and the development of relevant kind of services associated with that. So our three core area of focus at the moment is on autonomous technologies, looking at specifically connected and autonomous vehicles. We're leading two CAV projects. The first CAV project, which is Ventura, which is looking essentially at the trust issue of the trust that people have in these technologies, both inside and outside of the vehicle. We are also leading Flourish, where we're looking at a specific use case, the elderly, and looking at what is the requirement, the human requirement for these technologies, to make those technologies suited to the humans. We're also involved heavily in the mobility as a service space, looking at it from a perspective of the end user, looking at issues related to smart ticketing, journey planning, and so on. And it's all underpinned by data. So we're heavily involved in the space of data analytics, looking at new methods, including machine learning, artificial intelligence, and truly harnessing the intelligence that we need from this data and ensuring that it enables these services and automation solutions that we are looking at. Thank you.
Sam?
Hi, I'm Sam Clifton. I'm an associate at InMotion Ventures. InMotion is the venture capital division of Jaguar Land Rover. So we're an early stage technology investor. We're investing from seed stage through to Series B globally. And to date, we've invested in about 11 companies, predominantly in the US and the UK, across ride hailing, child transportation, data platforms, and new forms of public transport, new business models for public transportation. So yeah, really interested and excited to get into some meaty discussion today. Thanks.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm Alex Weedon. I work for the Transport Systems Catapult. We're one of 10 government-funded agencies that are set up to help drive innovation in certain areas. Our particular focus is around intelligent mobility in the sense of connected and automated transport, new business models in transport, data in transport innovation, and we support that through a strong network of SMEs and academia. I just wanted to point out that I think Morgan set us up for a fall here, because with all of those quotes, and then we have a whole panel on futurism. So I'm nervous now.
Thanks, Alex. So I wanted to start off by sort of asking how intelligent mobility is going to evolve. Or is it going to evolve? Or is it going to be a revolution? Ella, you're probably best placed to answer this. Autonomy is at the forefront of this change. Do you think we're going to see incremental adoption of intelligent mobility, or is it going to come like a storm and change the world we in an unexpected way, I guess?
So the fair answer, and the kind of civil servant in me, says that we need to be prepared for both. Obviously, we don't develop the technology, so I can't say to you hand on heart, I know exactly how difficult it is to introduce these things, or exactly how humans might react to them. So, all said and good, it might find that actually it excludes half of the population for whatever reason because of how we've designed it. So there are risks that it might be incremental. It might only be for the wealthy for a really long period of time. But there are also quite a few kind of spearheads in this area who are saying that, I don't know if you've read the Rethinks report, but for those of you who haven't, have said that essentially the accumulation of these three different tech changes, so transport as a service, electrification and automation, will see a huge change in the way that we kind of digest transport or use transport networks. And within 10 years of seeing these vehicles on the market, 95% of passenger miles will be travelled in one of these vehicles. Obviously, that has huge potentials to disrupt the transport ecosystem. And I think we need to be thinking about both options, thinking about how we can kind of tailor either options as they develop so that we're in control of them rather than being scared of them or batting them away, and actually seeing that they deliver the benefits that they quite often promise.
Well, it all depends on what we mean by evolution and revolution, especially. If we mean by revolution a step change, then I would say from the perspective of some of the underpinning concepts of intelligent mobility, we can expect some revolution, going, for example, from car ownership to use-ship, from an operator-centric system to a user-centric system, from a non-connected world to connected world, from a human-driven world to an automation-driven world. These are all revolutionary concepts. Will they be implemented overnight? Well, I think the key question here really is whether we want seamlessness and sustainability. Obviously, there are a number of questions we need to address, not least from the perspective of the legal and the insurance questions. For example, who is liable in the case of an accident of an autonomous vehicle? Is it the vehicle manufacturer? Is it the telecoms provider because they interrupted the update just before the car was driving off? Is it the actual user because they didn't press a button to provide the update? Who is liable? And these are the kind of questions that we will need to progressively address in order to be able to implement the new kind of system sustainably. Also, it's clear it will have to be a progressive transition because the society is at the center of it, and we need to first convince society that there is a better alternative going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, I think like 8 years ago when Waymo, or when it was in Google, started their self-driving program, they were sort of doing road shows at tech fests and that kind of stuff. And I don't think anybody would have seen them then and thought the magnitude of this change is going to be so huge. And now we're at a stage where they've driven, I think it was something like 3.5 million miles and simulated over 1 billion miles with their autonomous vehicles or their autonomous systems. And now we're at the stage where they're starting to roll out autonomous fleets. They're kind of early commercial pilots or early commercial fleets anyway. And now we're at a stage where we're thinking, obviously the main impact of those fleets is going to be just changing how people move and how goods move dramatically, changing road layouts and changing how we build new cities. But then there's also going to be the secondary, the tertiary effects of that macro trend. I think I read this anecdote about when the car was first produced, the guy that had the foresight to go out and buy real estate out of town to then create Walmart, in just the foresight to see the change that the car was going to bring, the car, then the motorway network, and then therefore the opportunity for out-of-town shopping centres and all this stuff. There'll be those same changes. Where will people live when autonomous becomes more prevalent? Will they live further away from cities? Will there be a reverse urbanisation? How will it change the property market? How will it change retail? And Amazon is already starting to change how we interact with shops, and now if the shop can come to me, how does that change how I would purchase goods or anything like that? So I think, a huge change to come, revolution, I want to say.
Alex?
So I'm going to hedge my bets. It's one of those things where if you look at the way the transport sector is split out, there are tens, hundreds of thousands of participants, people in supply chains, the users, the government agencies, and we've got a great sort of demographic of that here today. But you think of all the different types of organisations in the different then modes of transport, so rail, road, all the rest of it. You will get revolution. You'll get revolution in specific areas. For example, the Uber business model, for example, you could say that disrupted, the taxi industry hugely. But actually, as a bigger part of the transport zeitgeist, if you like, how revolutionary has that been? It's probably only a small effect, really, in real terms. So when you think of transport as being this massively complex machine with all of these different moving parts, it probably will look like in certain sectors there'll be revolutions, but actually overall you'll probably see a smoother evolutionary change as time goes on.
Sure. I mean, we're going to come on to talk about data in a second, but it's the transport ecosystem is quite unique in how complex it is, how interrelated it is. So are you sort of saying that, perhaps certain pockets of that which are sort of more siloed in a way, you can see faster innovations, but if you're sort of horizontal or addressing larger markets, then it might be more incremental because you're taking other people with you?
Yes, I think so, and I think actually it's also, even when you don't take people with you, because you can only affect a certain part of the market in terms of how you do your business, then actually, and that's partly down to regulation, and we'll talk about all of that sort of stuff, I guess, as time goes on. But we talk about regulation, we talk about the insurance issues and all of that kind of thing. There are players in the transport system that aren't actually transport providers, and therefore you just won't get necessarily that kind of a revolution that will happen, because in my mind, revolution's kind of evolution over a much shorter period of time, right? It's I think that's really where we'll end up.
I think if you take a macro like electrification as well, and all the stakeholders that have to work together, whether it's the infrastructure providers who aren't related to mobility, and they have to work with the technology providers who are iteratively improving their technology. But I think, the challenge of getting all those people on the same page is one of the big challenges of driving this revolutionary change, and I guess why it takes some time to get everybody to work together and to enact that change.
Yeah, I think it requires a cultural shift in some sense from a perspective of of industry and SMEs and governments and everybody else. So that's something which will take time.
So my answer to that is, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of barriers in place, and we spend a lot of time thinking about them, and we're not going to be able to solve the regulations for these vehicles or how they're managed overnight. I guess my kind of flip side to that is, once quite a few of those barriers have been broken down, so once you've seen quite a few people start to accept kind of new mobility models as the norm, will we see kind of massive changes in the way we demand and consume transport as a result of that? And will that happen quite quickly? And my personal bet is yes. In cities.
Actually, yeah, and I was going to say DFT and Centre for Cav have done loads of stuff with the guidance for testing of autonomous vehicles. And I know if we look at the States and we look at California, and I think it was 3 years ago when they enacted their legislation for handing out licenses for testing autonomous vehicles. Maybe that's because the US, just by nature of its legislative framework, they can make changes like that quicker just because it's state-based. But still, I think recently DFT has done loads of really great work to drive forward the sort of the testing of these vehicles, and alongside projects like UK Auto Drive, which is the government working hand in hand with the industry to fast track this innovation. So I think we're progressing forwards. I think it's getting quicker.
I would agree. If you look at the fact that about 2.5 years ago there were 0 CAV projects in the UK, and now you have over 50, I think that's obviously testimony that we got something right.
I think the interesting thing is about that is I've got a half remembered quote as well, and it might be from you, Wolfgang, but I'm not sure. There was a US government prediction back in 2014 that we wouldn't have autonomous cars on the road until 2035. It's that kind of change, I think.
Great, great. Also, 2.5 years ago, there were hardly any intelligent mobility events. Now there seems to be one every other day. So it makes it even more satisfying that we've had such a great turnout. We're talking about autonomy a lot. I think that's going to be quite a strong theme. But there are also some other pretty strong forces coming through from an innovation perspective. I mean, we've mentioned electrification and sustainable energy. Obviously, you've got autonomy and AI, 5G, and it's just around the corner in terms of connectivity. Do you see any one of these being more dominant than the others? How do you think it's going to play out? Is there a sort of causal relationship between some of them? Anyone? Wolfgang?
Well, automation obviously has a number of benefits. So if you put in autonomous vehicles on the road, you can improve the safety, you can potentially improve the environmental impacts. But I would say if you had to single out one specific of those three, I would say it is connectivity. Because connectivity really allows us to strategically optimize our system as a whole, our intelligent mobility ecosystem. And thereby, it is bound to provide quite a lot more benefits, because now we're no longer talking about improving the safety and the environmental impact of a single vehicle. Now we're talking about a whole network of vehicles which can work together, not only amongst themselves, but also with a wider ecosystem, looking at the likes of the IoT, smart cities, smart motorways, and so on.
Yeah, I think potentially connectivity has an even broader impact outside of intelligent mobility and mobility transport, just to such a huge extent it affects our lives massively. I think also, as we see the introduction of automation, it kind of will go hand in hand with electrification. And I think it's a good opportunity as we move towards those vehicles to really drive the electrification agenda as well. Yeah.
The one thing that sort of sticks in my mind is that we talk very heavily about the actual technology, but I think it's more about how you monetize the outcomes of that technology. So how do you, and I think it sort of feeds on what Wolfgang was saying just now, it's not just about the connectivity between vehicles and things, actually it's also about connectivity with things like commerce, buying things and buying services and products, in transport, while you're actually being transported from one place to another. It's about having that customer experience around transport, which is going to be different.
So I think that I should confess at this moment in time, I've spent the last 2 years working on the connected side of connected and autonomous vehicles, so I'm a little bit biased. But I think that autonomy grabs the headlines and it is easier for people to understand and to relate to. So you drive regularly. If you're a driver, you would get driven. Taking yourself out of that system is something you can imagine and is something that sci-fi has been dealing with for years. But connectivity will connectivity will deliver the benefits, and connectivity will make it kind of nice for you to have that experience, because otherwise you're just not driving. If you have connectivity, you have the option to work in your car. In the future, you have the option to use VR in your car. You have huge kind of potential changes which are open to you. Connectivity can make it so that the transport network runs more efficiently, so you aren't just kind of stuck in a jam and you see cars behaving like a hive. And then electrification, those two kind of changes for me are the way that electrification can break this market failure that it has at the moment.
Yeah, and about connectivity, we should add that we are already mostly connected in our vehicles in one way or another. If we have a smartphone, we're connected inside the vehicle. And connectivity is much easier to roll out. I believe as of 2021, it is mandated that there's a certain basic level of connectivity across all new vehicles. And there are companies working on the retrofit of the older vehicles. So it's much easier and faster to roll out than autonomy.
I've got two remarks, I guess. One is connectivity is great if you're in a city. What happens if you're out in the sticks? Does that become a barrier in itself? And I guess the second one, please correct me if I wanted to ask about 5G and its rollout. 5G is sort of coming online in 2020. Is it going to take a couple of years for us to develop the capability and the reliability to provide that transformational effect, or is it because it's almost going to happen instantly, I guess?
It's a good question. Looking at the first question first, if you're talking about connectivity, obviously, if you look, let's say, if I go from London to Bristol, half the way, I don't have any signal on my mobile phone. So connectivity in the more remote areas is still an issue, but that is something we need to look at very carefully, depending upon what kind of level of service we're trying to provide with connected and autonomous vehicles. And in terms of the rollout of 5G, it's a good question. There obviously is a lot of work ongoing in that domain currently. So the likes, especially in the Bristol area, Bristol is open, is obviously invested currently, I think, £75 million into connecting Bristol in its entirety. So it's kind of like going towards this IoT, smart city kind of infrastructure. So I would say there's a lot of work ongoing, and how quickly it will roll out? Tough question.
Yeah, so yes, like coverage in rural areas is really important. I think that we're in a year where we'll see quite a lot of change for that. The MNOs are improving their coverage. They should have 98% coverage by the end of this year. And that will play a really important kind of role in improving people in rural areas' access to mobile phone coverage and data and streaming and all of the benefits that comes along with that. In regards to the 5G question, I would put my bet on it'll be kind of slow. It's not kind of going to be a snap your fingers and it's there moment. The rollout of 5G, and this, when I'm saying it, I'm talking about the kind of small cells, large packets of data going very quickly but not very far, requires quite a lot of infrastructure, it requires quite a lot of coordination, and it requires quite a lot of delivery that we're working on. We're trying to get there, and hopefully it will be faster than the 4G rollout, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Do you think you need 5G connectivity for autonomous? Because really a lot of the developments that we've seen to date have been based on vehicles that are operating offline, that are able to perceive their environment, make decisions based on the potential risk, and operate without having to continuously connect to via whatever signal it is.
I think it really depends on the use case, because if we take aviation as an example, bandwidth is saturated. You have a lot less aircraft in the air, which are providing a lot less data than individual CAVs may provide. So there are some serious bandwidth limitations ahead. Can we achieve the bandwidth requirement with 4G? Probably not. Can we achieve them with 5G? We don't know.
And I guess the autonomous future where we get to the cars, communicating to each other, communicating to the infrastructure, zipping across junctions and things like that, the timescales for those are probably that much further, and they'll come with these technological developments in connectivity. But I think a lot of the fleets that we've seen rolled out to date have been in geographically constrained areas or certain circumstances like a motorway network or something. So actually we might get those vehicles without the requirement for 5G starting to see adoption, starting to see them rolled out. And maybe there doesn't need to be a rush into 5G, particularly for autonomous.
So I think that the viewpoint from quite a few of the automotive manufacturers is that the car's not ever going to rely on a network connection to operate. But having a network connection and having 5G, which could potentially enable vehicle-to-vehicle or vehicle-to-infrastructure communications, is where you see kind of added benefits. So this is where you'd see the vehicles behaving like a hive, being able to reduce congestion, potentially in the future getting rid of all of our traffic lights and road signs.
The other thing is that where people's interactions with those things are dependent on connectivity. So, if you don't have the connectivity or the bandwidth, and I'm thinking particularly in rural areas, then, you can't get an Uber, even if Uber would go to the middle of nowhere. So actually I think that's also where connectivity will have an impact, is actually how you can push those technologies out to the users and to the customers.
Okay, great. So sort of connectivity is perhaps a bit more sort of an underlying technology or an enabling technology. Autonomy is a bit more sort of front-end user application. I mean, all of this is churning out loads of data. And, in a very complex system, what are the sort of economic, the political, the security barriers that we need to overcome to realize these opportunities? And to what extent is data, is data playing a role in that? Anyone?
Yeah, that's a big question. That is huge. So I'm going to narrow into data. What we just described with this kind of wonderful ecosystem of everything talking and communicating would rely on rapid communication and rapid sharing of data, such as location data, between vehicles and between the infrastructure and between your service providers. And the sharing of data in this way could have huge potential to kind of massively change the world and make it really, really exciting. But there are definitely barriers in place. Things like who owns the data? It gets infinitely more complicated. So if you own your car, you kind of think, well, I own my location data. But the car company thinks, well, I own a bit of that data. If you rent a car, then have you signed over your location data to the car company or to the rental car? Trying to figure out how those things are going to map together. It's quite a complicated task, and one people are obviously very worried about, because that's also where a lot of the value is going to come from.
Yeah, I think you made a good point there at the end as well on the value of data, because that is one of the key barriers we see to collaboration. Currently, we still see a lot of OEMs and other stakeholders just holding a tight grip over the data because they don't know the value of the data, just in case there is some value in this data. So that's a huge challenge, especially if we're talking about standardization. How will we ever achieve standardization? How will we ensure that the safety critical data, for example, will be shared between vehicles? That has obviously policy and regulatory questions behind it. The other big question is also about ownership and also control of data. Who actually controls this data? Do I want to know, my service provider, the mass service provider, mobility as a service provider, know where I'm going every day? Maybe I do. Maybe I get some benefit from that, but maybe I don't. Who is actually in control of that data? And what implication does that have in terms of how willing individuals are to adopt these new services?
So we did some work with the ODI back at the front end of the year, and some of the data that came out of that research was that efficiency savings, and this is efficiency savings, so not opportunity cost, if you like, but efficiency savings of something like £14 billion in better and more efficient sharing of data across different transport activities. So that's quite a big chunk of money, and that doesn't take into account, actually, there must be businesses out there or people with ideas out there who need data to try and verify those ideas and try to use those data in a new way that provides value. The difficulty is because you're then going to the data owners who think, well, there might be some value here, so I'm going to charge you, I don't know, £1 million for my data. Well, that doesn't really work as an opportunity, because you're then actually just cutting off your customer base effectively, because if you can commoditize that data, you can make that data available based on, say, a usage or something else, then you actually have something related to a metric. Then you're not just putting an arbitrary sum on the value of that data, because the data is only worth what somebody will pay for it at the end of the day. And if you don't know what you can use that data for, then surely that data is worthless to you. It's a byproduct of the things that you might be doing as an OEM or as a train operator or as or even as a service provider somewhere along in the transport system.
I mean, I think we're going to talk a bit about the value of data exchange in the next panel. The Transport Systems Catapult, you've just announced a data hub, haven't you? Yeah. Could you tell us a bit about that project and what's the purpose of it and the goals of it?
Sure. So we set up a data hub which collected together certain data, mobile network data, road traffic data, freight movement data, roadworks data, mapping data, and the idea of that was, and the way that we negotiated those particular licenses allow us to use those with SMEs and with universities up to a proof of concept stage, which helps unblock that problem to a certain extent. And in a way, the sort of the argument that we posed was if you give us your data and allow us to use it this way, we're effectively creating your customers of the future, for those customers for the data. We can actually work with commercial parties with those data as well, but they can't get access to it. So that means that we have to do the work with them. But that's just because you've still got that slight nervousness about opening data up to potential commercial competitors. But the other thing that the Data Hub allows people to do is actually bring their own data. So if you've collected data and you've got data from somewhere else, and actually you might have scraped that data from validly open sources, and you want to compare it against somebody's mobile network data or something else, then we can do that as well. And that's the other unique piece about it, is that actually when you normally license data from somebody, they will normally exclude your ability to use it with other people's data, and we could do that.
Sure. Sam, last night I was at the InMotion Ventures conference. You were talking about sort of data and regulation on stage there, the panel. Is government doing enough in this space? Does government need to innovate?
Yeah, I guess that's a difficult question. And to be honest, I'm not close enough to the regulation, actually, to be honest. But I think, obviously, they play an important role in ensuring that we can drive innovation. So with my investor hat on, companies that are able to create marketplaces for data, companies that are able to, democratize data. People, over the years, since kind of, Facebook and these platforms, people have become more and more aware of the value of personal information and that what the value of that data is. And I think there will be opportunities for companies to come along, create marketplaces for mobility data, and create added value services on top of that. And the government's role, I guess, is to support that innovation and support that with regulation and make it as easy as possible. But as I said, I don't quite know as much as the other guys might.
Yeah, I think regulation will have to come into play in order to ensure the safety of the system, whatever that system may look like. When you're looking at mobility as a service, or whether you're looking at a connected autonomous vehicle, in order to ensure that collectively we gain those benefits and ensure that whatever we put in place can be operated safely. So I think government will have to play a key role in that in order to ensure that different stakeholders adhere to those guidelines.
Yeah, and allow room for innovation from the private market and
without stifling innovation. That's
definitely
really the key here.
Sure. Great. So, I mean, one thing data does do is give you personalization of services. That's being touted as one of the key advantages of mobility as a service. What do you think we can expect from new types of services, existing services that are out there in terms of customer service, price, individuality, comfort, other factors like that going forward?
Yeah, so I think today people have choice in the services they choose, whether or not it's public transport and the kind of delta between price and convenience or speed, through to private vehicles, they're either their own or use a ship through mobility services. So I think over time, as we move towards autonomy, as we move towards, new public transport models, whether it's on-demand public transport or Hyperloop or whatever it may be, I still think there'll be opportunity for differentiation, whether it's service, whether it's, price related to service, price related to speed. And I think people will always want choice, whether or not it's getting into a low-cost, possibly Chinese-made autonomous pod, or whether they want to get into a premium vehicle with the JLR Hound. So, it is going to be really interesting to see how people begin to kind of make choices around what they want from their mobility service. I think if you look over to the States, where they've got two big ride-hailing providers, how do you differentiate between those today? It's when is it going to turn up? Is it 3 minutes or 4 minutes? What's the price? Well, it's pretty much identical price. So it's somewhat of a commodity product. So as we move towards autonomous, or I guess with Uber, you have Uber X or whatever. But as we move towards new mobility services, where are the opportunities for differentiation? And I think that will be interesting to see how that progresses. I do think it will persist. Brands will persist.
I think one of the benefits of services such as mobility as a service is that it provides more seamlessness and comfort for if your travel includes several different modes. I'm sure a lot of us have already had the experience of running to the train station just to catch the train just because a bus was late by 2 minutes. We had to tactically react to that scenario. As part of mobility as a service, that kind of scenario would be managed for us, therefore making our journey a lot less stressful, a lot more comfortable. And I think that's going to be a key distinction between a user-centric approach to transport operations and the current operator-centric approach to transport operations.
So if I could, I think the thing that really excites me about mobility as a service is the idea that you can get this personalised service. And a while ago, I did a project for the National Deaf Children's Society, and they explained to me that quite a few children who seek their services have trouble when travelling on the bus, because the bus only makes announcements when it's rerouting via the tannoy. And so they don't get information about where they're going because they haven't heard it. And I love the idea that mobility as a service can make it so that everybody gets access to the same information in the way that is easiest for them to digest. So you could communicate with your local kind of tube station saying, I'm coming, I need assistance, and let them get prepared in advance. And I think that's its great selling point to me.
Yeah, we're very lucky to be by King's Cross here. It's a great multimodal piece of infrastructure. I'm quite often shooting up to Birmingham or other places in the north of England and come straight back into the office for the last hour of the day, Morgan. I want to sort of raise the concept of utility. Some people utility means time. Some people it means price. I know we're talking a lot about autonomous at the moment, but sort of overnight transport, getting from A to B. You haven't wasted any time there. Do you think we'll see personalization? Do you think we'll see data being used to offer different types of utility to different people, and perhaps elaborate on that?
I guess as you touched on earlier about how people use vehicles and how that changes. People can live further away from cities and they can commute in overnight, kind of in a bed in a car, or whether or not actually they spend the first hour of the day commuting, but they can work in an office-like environment in the vehicle. So when you talk about utility, I guess we're talking about what is the actual, how does the function of the vehicle change? So sorry, I'm making this very autonomous focus, but I think that's where I see quite a big change, and people can then sort of harness different functions of these vehicles, and as a result be sort of more efficient with their travelling or whatever.
Okay, I just want to sort of talk about the UK for a bit. We've got about 5 minutes or so left. There seems to be a bit of a race on between different countries to provide the best ecosystem for intelligent mobility. How well do you think the UK is doing in this? We have a slightly different transport ecosystem. It's slightly less regulated. We've got private-public partnerships. Is that sort of putting us in a good stead, or is that sort of hindering us, would you say?
I think as an environment, we've got a really great place to be in terms of intelligent mobility in development. I mean, we've got a great investment in innovation in this area. We've got great facilities. We've got great companies working in that field. We're great at innovating. I think sometimes the bits that people are, and there's a political will to do it, by the way. So that's clear. There is a political will to do it. And the conversations that I have with a lot of agencies, DFT and Network Rail and Highways England, they're saying we want to innovate. We want to understand how we can innovate. Where I think we need to work to make things simpler are through, say, procurement processes and things like that. So Innovate UK obviously do a great job pushing money out through grants But grants only have a certain amount of value. You know, they can help you develop a technology, but they don't help you find necessarily the market in which you can monetize that technology. And don't get me wrong, they've got great showcase program and lots of great connections. And you know, those collaborations that they build with people like Flourish Collaboration, for example, you know, those will probably lead to long-lasting business relationships. You know, that's what you would hope would happen. But lots of companies say I sort of focus on SMEs because that's really my area of focus at the Catapult. But actually, it's all companies. They say, well, you've got this pot of money, but we don't know how to access it. You know, we can do a tender, that's great, and the likes of Atkins are perfectly set up to do that. But actually, what is actually put out for tender doesn't necessarily encourage the innovation. So it's trying to find the right mechanism, and we try to do that at the Transport Systems Catapult, and I'm having conversations with all of those sorts of agencies to try and improve their procurement mechanisms to be a little bit more innovation focused, rather than, you know, because we're buying, you know, 100 kilometres of track, or we're buying 1,500 tonnes of tar macadam, or whatever it is, because that's how traditionally the procurement systems have been set up.
I think the UK has set up an excellent funding and regulatory framework overall. The challenge, of course, is whilst funding individual projects is great, especially initially, and trying to test new technologies or do some research on specific aspects of technologies, the key challenge will be to bring all those different projects together to truly harness that potential that intelligent mobility can bring.
So, for those of you who don't know, the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles has a pot of money called the Intelligent Mobility Fund. And projects such as Flourish and Ventura have been funded through this process. When we first started, we had this 100 million. We were releasing it quite quickly. And we got told we need to be careful. We might need to slow down because we don't want to flood the market and end up funding companies which might not be of the highest quality. And that has absolutely not been the case. We've had to turn down amazingly high quality projects because we just don't have enough money. So I think that the skills and the ambition and the companies are absolutely there. I think one of the things that we have to do as an organisation and as a country is learn to take risks a bit more and learn to understand that actually projects can fail, projects should fail. If we think that if we have spent all of our £100 million on projects which have gone to market perfectly and seamlessly, then we probably haven't been risky enough.
Yeah, I think with my sort of institutional investor hat on, starting right at the earliest end of the spectrum with sort of pre-seed and seed stage funding, the UK is beginning to have a really great network. The stuff the UK BAA is doing, the support for early stage founders, accelerators, incubator programs, all this stuff is really positive. And then that kind of streams into seed stage funding. And obviously in London, we have some amazing seed, Series A stage investment funds that are looking increasingly at the mobility space because it's such a huge potential market. They're looking to mobility and looking to back that. And then I think the next stage is how do we scale those businesses? And then in the UK, I think certainly at the earlier stage, we've begun to see more funding, but at that maybe growth stage or that slightly later stage, we're starting to see, I think, more growth capital coming into the UK. But that's a stage, I think, which we need to support as well. Certainly at the earlier stage as well, the R&D stuff, the R&D investment that we have from the government, the budget today, $2 billion investment into R&D and supporting early stage businesses. All that kind of stuff is really important to kind of a concertina. You get the knock-on effect of supporting early stage and taking that through to huge scale, which is kind of what we want, where we can have businesses in the UK that have been founded in the UK that are operating on the global stage, which I guess is, with the investor hat on, is where you want to get to. But also I think for progress, for UK's role in the progress of this space, I think is really important as well.
Great. I'm just looking at my watch, and I think we're about on time. I'd agree. It's scaling these innovations out of the UK is something that's very important. It's something that we work hard at EIT Digital to support. and that's how you sort of create real impact, I guess, which is going to benefit society and improve and change people's lives. Ella, Wolfgang, Sam and Alex, thank you very much for your contributions today. It's been great to, I feel we've almost just scratched the surface in a way, but it's been great to have you up on stage and kick off this afternoon's proceedings. So could you join me in giving them a round of applause?
Thanks.
Thank you.